I would like to introduce the members of the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. First, we have the head today, which is Carolyn Resnick, and the other members are Naomi Marrow, Amy Friedman, and Tyler Beebe. And I think Carolyn has a couple of words to say first. Carolyn?
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Bob, for coming. Thank you for everybody who came. And especially I want to thank Joan because over the years she has facilitated this program, and to the library, of course, the Chappaqua Library for hosting it and for making it work. The program has been going on for 23 years, literally 24th year. It began with simply a group of people reading the same things and discussing, simply a discussion group in a sense. And then it moved to in-person speakers. And then with COVID, of course, to Zoom. And everybody in the world discovered Zoom. And it's now virtual, which has the advantage that we are able to get marvelous speakers now who can come in from everywhere, such as Bob, who's coming in from Washington, I assume, right? That could have been coming in from Iceland yesterday. So we've had speakers from different parts of the world. Um, there's a group of five of us who talk about issues and decide which ones we think we want to focus on. There's 7 programs in the fall semester to use an academic year, 7 programs in the spring semester, and then we go off and we look for speakers, eminent speakers. And I had suggested the Arctic because it seems to be exploding in the news now with the search for minerals, with geopolitical relations, with warming, which is opening up a much better Northwest Passage, the melting of the permafrost, and all sorts of issues that are going on there. There are 7 countries in this world who have frontiers is north of the Arctic Circle, and so just that in itself makes it an international hotspot. So I'm going to introduce Bob, and I think we'll let him talk about all the other things that are going on. Bob Orttung, I'm pronouncing that right? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Bob Orttung is the professor of sustainability and international affairs at George Washington University. He's part of the Elliott School for International Affairs, and he serves as the director of the Sustainability Research Institute. And you began, I found, of interest with your career in Russia. Did you study there, or you lived there, or born there?
Uh,
And
yeah, I spent my part of my graduate school time in 1989 to 1990. I lived in what was then Leningrad and then became St. Petersburg. So I traveled to Russia a lot, but not recently.
no, how lucky you are! How exciting! Wow, some of us spent graduate school in far less interesting places, but that's wonderful. And so he has focused his academic career on Russia for a while. It changed during the 80s and the 90s. More recently, he's focused on aspects of the Arctic, including Russia, Northern Europe, Canada, and Alaska. His interests include urban sustainability, tourism, and the global competition for the Arctic's resources. And so, Bob, um, go for it. And he welcomes questions. I think we probably would prefer that you put them into chat, and we will try and get to everybody's questions. But thank you for coming, and Bob, go for it.
All right, thank you very much for having me. I'll share my slides here. Here we go. Okay, here we go. So what I wanted to do today in my presentation, I thought I'd talk for a little bit, but please interrupt if you have a question about a certain thing, or I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. But what I wanted to do is just give a brief overview of the research topics I work on and sort of an introduction to the Arctic, starting with an introduction to the Arctic, maybe a few current events, and then some of the research things I work on in terms of geopolitics, energy, and resources. So let me start with the map. Just thanks, Carolyn. You mentioned that there's 7 countries with, on the Arctic Ocean, and of course the Arctic is all water, unlike Antarctica, which is land. And usually it's frozen. And in this map, you can see the countries. Starting with the U.S., Alaska, of course, makes us an Arctic country. Canada, Greenland, which is still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, although it's seeking more autonomy and perhaps independence as its own country. And that's obviously been in the news lately with our president. But then Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia also. And here you can see they all have different claims to land within the Arctic. So this hasn't been a problem in the past, but these claims eventually might create some territorial conflict over who controls what, this is basically the center of the Arctic Ocean. Um, but I was just at a conference, the Arctic Circle conference in Iceland, and that conference happens every year. And what was important there was the large presence of the military. And here you can see the Arctic Circle Conference is organized each fall by the former president of Iceland, President Grimson, and with the blonde hair. And then he was interviewing an Italian admiral who was representing NATO. So unlike in past years, I had never seen this high a presence of military officials. So I think typically, we think of the Arctic as a place where all the countries that are represented there get along. And that was really, Russia and then Western Europe, Canada, the US, and even after 2014, when Russia took the Crimean territory and started invading partly, small parts of Ukraine beyond Crimea, even after 2014, there was still a level of cooperation, both scientific cooperation and diplomatic cooperation among all the Arctic countries in the Arctic Circle, Arctic Council, which brought together all the Arctic states, Russia included. Now, unfortunately, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Arctic Council has basically suspended its operations. It no longer deals directly with Russia, except at the working group level. So it was very unusual to see such a military presence at these Arctic conferences. In previous years, the real focus had been on China. There had been a big Chinese delegation at this conference because the Chinese were very interested in the Arctic, but they were not so visible this year. It was really the NATO presence. And here you can see sort of an example of Russia's military bases in the Arctic. It looks pretty scary. They seem to have a lot of resources up there, but as typical with Russia, you don't have, they have the bark is worse than the bite because they don't have the resources, especially with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, to really build out an Arctic military presence. So they do have a presence, but it's not nearly as intimidating as this might look. A second feature of the conference was the real absence of the United States. And with the government shutdown, most of our usual government scientists and diplomats and other leaders were not present, were not able to influence the Arctic conversation. There was many of like Canadian, Norwegian defense establishments who are now have a lot of money because they're rapidly increasing their defense budgets, partly under pressure from the U.S., but partly because of the threat from Russia. And they had lots of money to spend on research with academics. And we're looking for those kind of collaborations. But of course, that's the opposite of what's happening in the U.S. Our military is no longer collaborating with the universities, which is going to make it difficult for the U.S. to compete in the Arctic. And then just one other thing I wanted to bring up, sort of before getting into my research, was the recent storm in Alaska, which has wiped out several dozens of villages, small, typically Native Alaskan villages in the western part of the state. And so this is really a function of climate change. They're getting much bigger storms, typhoons coming off the Bering Sea than they used to have in the past. And so this is really going to create some big issues. Like here, you can see a village before and after the storm. This is just a couple days ago, and the village is completely wiped out. And there's hundreds of people who are living in these villages who will no longer be able to live there. The conditions are not appropriate, and a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed by the storm. And so this is going to create a real problem. We don't have the FEMA response that we used to have, and the state of Alaska is not going to be able to deal with this situation on its own. It has a very tight, constrained budget due to the reduction in oil sales that it's been dependent on in recent years. And so this, um, I don't think it's been as much in our news or in our consciousness in the eastern part of the United States, just given all the other things going on these days. But it's a real problem in the U.S. part of the Arctic, and it's probably going to be something that we're going to have to be thinking about much more in the very near future. So let me sort of switch from this recent developments to just give you a sense of my research and where things are going. And so first, I want to start with a picture of the Alaska pipeline. Now, if many of you may have been to Fairbanks, Alaska, perhaps on a cruise or just traveling through Alaska. But this is the oil pipeline that brings the oil down from the North Slope down to Valdez, where it's shipped out in tankers. Um, it's interesting, just it's a real accomplishment in terms of engineering. They built this on permafrost, and the oil running through it is hot. So in order to preserve the stability of the ground, if you put that hot pipeline on the ground, it would actually thaw the permafrost, create a lot of problems. So they have these solutions, the tall pillars here, which are removing heat, so to keep the ground frozen underneath the pipeline as much as possible. But this is what Alaska's economy was depending on, since production started in the late 70s and 80s, kind of up and down with the price of oil, but a huge amount of the economy in Alaska was focused on oil production, and they don't have income taxes. They use that oil money to pay for their schools and roads and a lot of development. And now that money is running out. So Alaska is at a real crossroads, trying to figure out what is the future basis of its economy going to be? Where are they going to get energy from? Trump is talking about building a natural gas pipeline that would, perhaps follow a similar route to the oil pipeline that you see here. But that pipeline would cost about $50 billion. And Trump says the Japanese are going to pay for it or the South Koreans are going to pay for it, but that seems highly unlikely. And it's not clear that there would be a commercial benefit for that kind of, that scale of investment that you would get. You would be able to recoup that just by selling natural gas, which isn't nearly as valuable as oil is. And so what we're seeing is, so Alaska's at a crossroads in terms of its energy development. And what my research has been looking at was like, what's going on in Europe? What are some other options that we could have instead of developing more fossil fuels in our country? So here is a picture from Iceland. I was there a couple of days ago, and this is a geothermal plant. So Iceland, they're lucky to have the volcanic activity and the magma and that sort of thing. So they're able to produce 100% of their electricity from renewable resources, geothermal mainly. And in fact, they have so much extra electricity that they import a lot of bauxite and produce aluminum, which is a huge energy intensive process. But since they have vast quantities of, relatively cheap green energy, they're able to do that and become competitive in aluminum production. So, for a situation like Iceland, that's a very good solution. And then a lot of my work, additional work has been in Sweden, northern Sweden. We're kind of looking at what they're doing and how they're developing their economy in the north that might provide some lessons for Alaska. One benefit for Sweden was that it never really had a big fossil fuel industry. It never developed oil or natural gas in great quantities. And most of its electricity was coming from hydro, which is also a possibility in Alaska. And that was all built in the 1920s, with some consequences. When they built the hydro, they did a lot of damage to their rivers and killed a lot of fish that were living there. And that's been a problem to this day. But another solution that they've been looking at is wind power. And this is also, relatively clean, and the one on the lower picture here is the biggest onshore wind farm in Europe, near Piteå, Sweden. But the problem there is that that's the land that the local indigenous people, the Sami people, which is the only indigenous group really in Europe, but they like to herd their reindeer across this land, and the reindeer don't like the windmills. So it's you have a lot of land use conflict when you build these giant wind farms. So on one hand, everybody wants green power. On the other hand, the indigenous people feel like they don't have a voice in this process. They didn't have a say over whether this kind of wind farm gets built. And in Norway, there's even been court cases where the court required companies to remove the windmills that they put up, but the company hasn't actually done that. So we have a little bit of a legal standoff there. But these are alternative forms of power. And then the second thing that Sweden's doing is Sweden has long been a big producer of steel. So here you see in the northern capital of Luleå in Sweden, their old-fashioned steel plant, which burns coal. And then here's a brand new one. This was sort of a pilot project where they're creating fossil-free steel, which means that I'll show you a picture of the mine in just a minute, but they're mining the iron ore and trying to do that in a completely fossil-free way. And then they're going to turn the iron ore into steel using hydrogen and as both a source of power and as a way of converting the iron to steel. So this plant was a pilot plant. I think they've already torn it down and they're building a much bigger new one. And then along with that, there's another company, a second company that's also called Stegra, that's also building a green steel plant. So Sweden's quickly going from no green steel production, although they've long been a big steel producer in Europe, to having two of these plants that are going to produce steel in a fossil-free way. So we'll have green steel, and it seems to be competitive with regular steel, the kind of steel that's produced elsewhere using coal. This is the picture of what it's going to look like when the factory is complete. Here's a picture of what it looks like at the moment. And it's not clear you have the two different companies producing green steel. They haven't really coordinated where they're all going to get their iron ore from. There's the big mine up north, but it's not clear that it's enough to provide for two companies. So Sweden, you think of that as being organized and well run, but there seems to be a lot going on there that's running way beyond the bounds of anyone's particular control, and it might not make a lot of sense over time. But what's interesting is they're building that big factory, you see, they have to import a lot of workers. They don't have the local talent in that northern part of the country, which is, relatively unpopulated. They don't have the talent and just the workforce to build it. So they're bringing in workers. This is what we would call a man camp because it's basically a dormitory for a bunch of workers. And people are very concerned. Often when you bring in these kind of situations, it creates a lot of crime. There's a lot of drunkenness, drug use, prostitutions, rape, this kind of thing. Just because you have a bunch of young men workers who are concentrated and away from their home situations, away from their families, and just kind of up there to work. So the construction of this new industry is having a big impact on the local, sort of the nature of the local culture. And Sweden, just like the US, now has a right-wing government. They've been very much concerned about immigration there. They had a big influx of people from the Middle East over the last 10 years, from Syria, from other conflicts. And so there's been a backlash there, just like in the United States. And then this is causing further backlash, even as the green transition proceeds. But then here quickly is a picture of Kiruna, which is up in the far northern part of the country of Sweden. And this is where they get their iron ore. So you can see this huge mine that they've been working for 100 years it's a very interesting city. If you go up there, the mine really looms over the city in a way that it doesn't, that you wouldn't feel that kind of presence of the mine in a normal city, but here you definitely do. And if you look at this building right here, this is the mine administration, and they built it exactly to look like the UN headquarters in New York City. I wasn't sure what the rationale was for that, but it looks exactly the same as that UN headquarters that is famous in Manhattan. And then what's also interesting here is that you can see this valley where they're digging, and so this valley, as they move the mine farther and farther along, it's coming under this town, the town of Kurna, and they're actually having to move the town because these houses are starting to fall into the mine as the shaft moves, and so you can see here, for example, is a beautiful old church that was part of Kurna, but they just moved it about 3 miles down the road. They you can see these yellow things here. They lifted the whole church up and then kind of rolled it down very slowly, very carefully to a new location um, that's part of Kurna. And so northern Sweden, in addition to the mining, is also because of all that electricity supply, they've become a home for data centers. And so we're starting to see data centers pop up in places like northern Sweden. So this was about 10, 15 years ago, but the first time Facebook put one of its data centers outside of the United States. And so the attraction was, good internet connection in Europe, as well as the relatively cheap green electricity that they could use to run the data centers. And so, unlike in the US, like here in Washington, just outside of Washington, we have the world's largest concentration of data centers. Um, Here, they take the excess heat from the data centers in Sweden and then they put it into greenhouses because they definitely have a shortage of heat in northern Sweden up near the Arctic Circle. So, but they can use the excess heat that the data centers generate and grow vegetables, lettuce, other kinds of tomatoes and other things in these big greenhouses, just using the free excess heat. And they also put it into their district heating systems. So we're in the US, we're producing a lot of these new data centers as AI takes hold. All that heat, excess heat is just being blown mostly into the atmosphere. We pay a huge amount of money to cool the buildings to keep them at a normal temperature because they can get quite hot inside with all the computers. But here, they're actually recycling the heat and using it for good purposes. And Sweden's also a center of battery production. So Northvolt is very similar to the picture I showed you earlier of the new steel factory. There's a similar size factory that's building batteries. This company already went bankrupt once, and now it's owned by some California startups. But hopefully this time around, they'll be able to produce the batteries at scale and then start filling the need for batteries as we buy more electric vehicles and other devices. And here's a picture of our research team. We were actually staying in a small campground trying to save taxpayer money, but in these nice little cabins, and then picnicking outside for dinner. But the third woman on the left here, with her mouth open looking at the camera, that's the mayor of Luleå. And so we were very lucky to work with her. As part of our research program, we brought her to Fairbanks, Alaska, and then Yellowknife, Canada, other northern cities, and brought the mayors of those places also to northern Sweden with the hope of identifying best practices among the different northern cities. How are these cities dealing with the new energy environment, with mining, et cetera, and try to exchange ideas. And that's been very fruitful. Like, for example, the mayor of Luleå was surprised when we took her to the Fairbanks landfill to see how much waste is generated in American society and how much of it is not recycled. Whereas in Sweden, almost everything is recycled, reused, and what they don't reuse, they incinerate and create energy out of it. So they don't have the same kind of landfill situations that we have, which is quite interesting if you start to get down into the details of city management. And also, just as an aside, before we leave Sweden, I wanted to make a point. I grew up in Southern California, and I thought Southern California's main contribution to world culture was the shopping center. But it actually turns out the shopping center was invented in northern Sweden, and this is the world's first shopping center, which ironically it's called Shopping, and it's designed by the architect Ralph Erskine, who was a very famous architect about 50, working about 50, 60 years ago, um, developing northern buildings that fit into an Arctic northern climate. And so the idea here, the shopping center, was you want a place where people can socialize and meet, but indoors outside of the cold elements outside. And so now it's still a shopping center is still going on. It's not as quite as fancy as some of the other shopping centers that exist nowadays, but still quite a popular destination in downtown Luleå in northern Sweden. And then here I wanted to show, this is in Canada. We were looking at the Giant Mine, which is a huge mine in Yellowknife, Canada, in the Northwest Territories, so just a little bit east of Alaska. And this was very interesting. It's a gold mine, and it operated from the 30s up through the 90s. I think it went bankrupt finally in 1991-ish. And now, but what was interesting about the mine is that of course, the mine owners took all the gold and took all the profits, and what they left behind was 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide, which is a very deadly poison. And right now it's underground, it's in a permafrost chamber. But as the climate changes, as the weather gets warmer, that permafrost is thawing, and it's not clear what's going to happen to it. And so it's a very interesting case where there was mining activity. It had a huge impact on the local population. There's a town of about 20,000 people there, which is now the capital of the Northwest Territories. And it's not clear how they're going to be able to deal with this legacy of the mine. The Canadian government has put $6 billion into trying to figure out what to do about it. But still a lot of difficulty in understanding what exactly can be done. So then maybe I see a question come up, but maybe I just have a few more slides. So maybe I'll just quickly go through my slides and then finish up. So one other thing that we do in our research is work as much as possible with the local indigenous community, because all these areas in the far north, whether you're talking about Alaska or Europe or Russia, the indigenous presence is still quite strong. Most, unlike in the lower 48, most of them have never been pushed off their land. And so there's still a presence there. And unfortunately, they haven't had a big voice in the development of that region, but want to make sure that they do going forward, in particular because they want to assure that they're able to continue pursuing a subsistence lifestyle. And as you can see here, this was in Western Alaska. We were visiting some relatives of one of our colleagues out in Teller, Alaska, just north of Nome. And we spent the day fishing ourselves, actually, and we caught some salmon and then had it for lunch. But here they're smoking it and saving it to eat over the course of the winter. When there's not as much food available. So understanding the relationship with the indigenous is a key part of the Arctic experience. And then finally, a topic that is also near and dear to my heart is the impact of cruise ship tourism on Arctic communities. And so here you can see a boat in Bergen, Norway, one of the big cruise ships that's coming in. This has been a big source of these cruise ships are bringing huge numbers of people who otherwise wouldn't get into the far north up to see it. And so Alaska is also benefiting from a huge amount of cruise ship tourism. So our project is looking at what is the impact of these cruise ships on the cities and communities that they're visiting when people show up. And so cruise ships are a great great way to take a vacation. It's probably the best bang for your buck, because every single minute of your trip you know, you have entertainment, you have a nice group of new people to talk to on the boat, and then you can of course get off and do some excursions. So there's a huge number of people in this world who love to do this kind of thing. Um, so it's quite interesting. And so we've been looking at Alaska, where you're starting to get like a place like Juneau, Alaska, which has a population of 30,000, is now getting about 1.7 million people. And here in Norway, here's another picture. You can see a very small hamlet, really. It's only about 400 people living in this little place, but this gigantic cruise ship shows up in the fjord and has quite an impact on the local population. So understanding the impact of these cruise ships. Now, the cruise ships, of course, are getting bigger. They're getting more popular. The industry is growing. So it's having more of an impact both on the environment and the economies of the Arctic cities and these very small villages that they visit. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and I'd be very happy to take questions and discuss these things. Um, so I don't know, Amy, are you going to moderate that, or?
Bob, can you see the questions in chat yourself?
Yes, I can. So I
You want
think
to
I
go
see a
ahead and answer
question.
them?
Sure, starting with Charles's question. Let's see, how would what Sweden is doing transfer to a larger country such as the USA? Yes, that is an excellent question. And we've been trying to figure that out. In fact, one of my colleagues has a Fulbright scholarship, but she's based in Alaska, and she's trying to figure out how to bring Alaska officials over to Sweden to see what they're doing. But I think the key, you know, Sweden and Alaska are very different because Alaska had that oil industry for so long, and it really still has a lot of power. The people in government in Alaska, the governor, many of the legislators are connected to the oil industry, support the oil industry, and want to keep it going as long as they can. But there's a huge amount of opportunity for other kinds of power generation in Alaska, whether it's hydropower, wind power, solar power. The solar panels work very well, you know, when the sun's up from like February through November. So it's much longer than you might expect in the far north. And then when they are producing, if you had batteries, you can store some of that energy, especially in the Arctic summer when the sun never goes down. So there's just a huge amount of opportunity there. And so we were looking at Sweden as sort of a source of innovation and how to bring this all together. And my background is in social science, so I was kind of interested in the governance of all these things. And so in Sweden, unlike in the United States, you have very powerful local governments. They have the tax revenue, a lot of the tax revenue stays local, and the local government has the ability to work with local industry and really shape local politics to support local development. So I think there's some things that we could learn about governing from Sweden, like putting more authority, more resources at the local level, let the local folks figure out their problems a little bit more. But at the end of the day, it is the corporations in Sweden that are running the show. They have most of the power, and so local governments end up doing what the corporations want. So I think we need to find a balance, and Sweden is also struggling with this balance. Like, how much should everything depend on what the corporate entities want in terms of urban development, and how much should depend on what the people and other folks are kind of pushing for. Um, so there's a lot to learn, but you know, we often think of Sweden as this perfect example of the wonderful life, uh, but it is. I can't deny that, but it's not as perfect as we think of it when you start looking at the details and how things work and how much power the corporations have and how much power the people actually have in shaping the evolution of their life. Although there is more of a consensus there on what corporate power should look like and what life should look like in general. Okay, let's see. There's one, look at the number of towns in Sweden whose name end in Coping. Shopping restaurant, I would say. Oh, yeah, that's a little bit beyond me. Let's see. And then I think just to answer this question, the presentation is being recorded, so it will be available. Um,
Okay, how about questions from the panelists?
Yeah.
Naomi?
I've got
Ready to
one.
Right.
roll.
Go ahead,
Tyler,
Tyler.
Naomi?
Why don't you start?
Okay, I will. Thanks, Bob, for your comments. Very, very interesting. I'd like to focus on some of the military aspects of the Arctic that are posed to us vis-a-vis Russia and now to some extent China. Amazingly enough, China has declared itself I guess, a partial Arctic presence or something of that nature. Anyway, that's kind of a secondary issue. But what intrigues me is the fact that President Trump has been so focused on the Northeast passage, if you want to call it that, around Iceland and Svalbard and so forth up to the Arctic Sea, as an area that he feels has got to be paid attention to. It certainly does, and he's talked about, annexing Greenland and all that wonderful stuff. But I think most military-oriented folks would claim that it's the Northwest area where we're most vulnerable because we don't have any deep sea ports anywhere as close to the Bering Sea. We've got some Air Force bases up there in Alaska, but they're not particularly well positioned in terms of getting our aircraft up to interdicting, Russian flights up around Alaska and the Bering Sea and so forth. It's a very complex issue, but I wonder what your thoughts are on kind of looking more at the Northwest area, which we apparently are not particularly well prepared for, as opposed to the area over towards Greenland and Iceland.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. We've been doing some work in Nome because it's increasingly becoming a tourist destination, and there's a new graphite mine there. Um, and but what's interesting in terms of the military context is that they're trying to dredge out the port there to make that a deep sea port, which would be you're right, the first one on the west coast of Alaska there that would be sort of, positioning toward Russia and China. At that point, Russia is only 55 miles from Nome, if you look at the map, so it's quite close. And but the contracting for that deep sea dredging and the port reconstruction has been on and off again with its Army Corps of Engineers. So it's not really clear what's going on and to what extent our military leadership is focusing on that particular issue because it hasn't been developing as quickly as I would think it would. Um, the Alaska delegation in the Congress, Murkowski and the other senator and congressman have been very good advocates for Alaska and making sure that we have a lot of military investment up there. So that there is the Air Force has a lot there. And every time I go to Alaska, they're talking about, I hear more preparations for dealing with China. They're assuming there's going to be an invasion of Taiwan. Often they say it's going to be in 2027 because that's, following up on some of the Chinese documents that's when they'll be ready to actually do an invasion of Taiwan. So I think that there has been a lot of military preparation there. But again, like Russia, we talk about this a lot. We haven't really built out the infrastructure in a place like Nome to really be prepared for this. So, and given the current state of the Pentagon, it's not clear that there's really coherent thinking along these lines about what to do in that theater. I mean, certainly looking at all the other questions is very complex understanding. I think more concern based on more of a European focus is on what to do about Russia and Europe. And with Finland and Sweden now coming into NATO, they're realizing they don't have the infrastructure they need. A lot of their transportation links are north-south, and they realize they're going to want to be able to move tanks and other things to the Russian front, and so they're going to need a lot of east-west roads and railroads and that sort of thing. So I think we're starting to see in Europe a much more coherent and sober thinking about the Russian threat, what that means in terms of what they need to do to prepare and get ready. But again, they're not spending probably the money that they need to. They're talking about it, they're thinking about it, but it hasn't really translated into real action yet. But things are definitely moving in that direction.
Yeah.
Amy?
Yeah, so my question I think maybe is related to Tyler's, and I'm really thinking about military spending and military preparedness as part of an overall allocation of resources. And so a lot of what you're talking about are really green energy products. And I wonder how much there is a discussion, and maybe it's too soon since, Trump has been in office less than a year, but the invasion of Ukraine, not so new. Are you seeing with both local governments and obviously national governments really a reallocation of resources away from green energy and sort of a transition in the economy to allocating resources more towards military spending and meeting NATO obligations and thinking very differently about the Arctic, less as a site of resources and more just as a place to mobilize?
Amy,
And then I had,
Can I jump in with that? and
yeah,
ask,
sure.
What is the level, if any, of coordination across the nations bordering or in the Arctic? Because that gets to your question also. Is there any coordination or is it very independent?
Yeah. Okay. Let me try and there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe I'll start with the last question about the coordination and then get to the resources and changing of effort. Um, there has been strong coordination across the Arctic traditionally. I mean, in the last 50 years or so. And that's particularly with the Arctic Council. It's one place where Russia and the Western countries were able to work together. And up until recently, Finland and Sweden were neutral. They weren't part of NATO and they weren't really aligned with Russia. So you had a kind of a balance there. Russia didn't feel like it was everybody ganging up on them. But now all the Arctic countries except Russia are in NATO. Russia is the outlier, and we really don't have, the Europeans don't have good diplomatic relations with Russia. The US, we have a very incomprehensible presidential strategy toward Russia. It's not, one day he says one thing, the next day he says the exact opposite about Putin. So it's not really clear what's going on. The Europeans are very much afraid of Trump cutting some kind of deal with Putin and what that would mean for them. The optimistic scenario is that Putin would make concessions to please Trump, but to me, that seems highly unlikely. Putin has made it clear that he's not ready to make concessions, that he wants to, assume as much control of Ukraine as possible. So I think that the level of coordination is changing, whereas in the past it used to be an all Arctic thing, and the European countries, to some extent the U.S., really made an effort to work with Russia. And build this kind of they call it an exceptional area that was different from the rest of the world, so that there was more peace and cooperation up there. They would talk about high north, low tension was sort of a common phrase that you would hear. But that all changed when Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And now I would definitely say it feels like the Arctic is the Western Arctic versus Russia. So the level of coordination and cooperation across that West Russia boundary has really diminished. what does this mean for energy production and things like that? It's very interesting because the Europeans, of course, were very heavily dependent on Russian oil and Russian natural gas um, before the war started. And I would have thought that they would see the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, as a good excuse to get rid of their dependence on Russian fossil fuels and really move over to clean energy. And I think what we've seen is that they're slowly reducing their dependence on Russia for oil. I think they've cut off oil supplies and they're slowly reducing gas dependence. But often they replace it with bringing in natural gas and oil from other sources, whether from the US or from North Africa or to some extent Norway, which has a lot of production that's outside the European Union. So they're finding other sources of fossil fuels and slowly building out their alternative energy production. So we see a lot of growth in alternative energy, and I don't think Trump's going to be able to stop that. There's more and more use of solar, wind, other sources of renewable energy, but it hasn't been as quickly as we thought the changes would take place. And so I think, as usual, at the local level, I think people are still invested, whether in Sweden or to some extent in Alaska. You do see some startup companies that are producing wind power um, and solar power. And I think it all depends on the cost at the end of the day. Everything is driven by the cost. And so if you're able to demonstrate, like, Texas is a big producer of renewable energy these days because it's easier to produce that than to use oil and natural gas. And so I think um, as long as they can bring the cost down and develop new technologies like with batteries to kind of address some of the intermittency problems that you have with renewable energies, um, they'll continue to move forward. But it's clearly not at the speed that we would like to see. But I think that the innovation is still happening. And I think the Swedes and those folks, they understand the threat now from Russia. They really feel it. And so I think they're starting to work together, and there's a lot more coordination among the European countries. They also see a threat from the US. And talking to my Canadian colleagues at the conference, for example, they're really furious at Trump. I would say they're basically, as one of them told me, we're trying to rebuild our economy from the ground up. So to replace the past dependence on U.S. trade and working in U.S. markets and finding other ways, whether it's just working with their own markets or expanding ties to Europe and to Asia. So I think this is a time of ferment. It's a time of change for sure, and a lot of opportunities. And so I think even though Trump and Putin, they seem to see eye to eye that they both want to develop the fossil fuel industry. They've made that clear, but there's a real difference in their approaches, and they don't have a lot of common interests because Putin really wants the price of oil to be as high as possible. He needs as much money as he can get from selling oil to finance his military machine in Ukraine, as well as keeping up the standard of living in Russia. Trump, on the other hand, doesn't want high prices for oil. He wants relatively low prices for oil because otherwise it's going to create inflation. It's going to make it difficult for truckers and other industries in our country. So even though they both support the fossil fuel industry, they kind of have a divergence of in what ways they support it and what they expect to get out of it. So that I think is making it very difficult for them to find any kind of common language, even though Trump seems very interested in working with Putin. So I don't know, that was a long-winded answer.
Well, can I ask, it's a follow-up, and maybe this is not in your wheelhouse. How much in the Arctic, and where is the technology on methane capture as the permafrost melts? Is that something you know anything about?
Right. I have some colleagues who do permafrost studies, and so we
Okay.
joke that if it's about people, it's me. If it's about ice, it's them.
Okay, you got it.
But to my knowledge, talking with them, I don't think that there's much going on to deal with that. I mean, a lot of that's in Russia, as the permafrost thaws in Russia. all these methane gases are being emitted and things like that. All kinds of diseases are becoming back and things like that. Stuff that's been frozen for thousands of years is now, unfrozen. Um, but I don't think that we've been able to deal with that on the scale. One thing
Yeah.
I saw when I was in Iceland, they have some carbon capture plants where they're trying to capture carbon out of the air so that you could, in theory, burn more fossil fuels or reduce the amount of carbon that's there and potentially, um, lower the global temperature rise. Um, but that is also, heavily dependent on having a lot of energy to run that kind of thing. And it only worked probably in a place like Iceland where you do have that energy that you can easily get from the geothermal sources.
Mm.
So I don't, yeah, so I haven't seen a lot of that. And that's certainly a concern, though, that people are thinking about as the climate changes.
What about issues like rising sea levels, the impact on the fish supply from cruise ships and other contaminants, if you will? Is there any coordination across boundaries, like the Arctic Circle? Who's having a discussion about those kinds of environmental human issues?
Mhm. Well,
Okay.
yeah, the certainly the Arctic Council has been focused on these environmental consequences and trying to coordinate across boundary. But as I was showing you with those pictures of Western Alaska and the last couple days, the storm that's hit there, um, that's also a consequence of sea level rise. A lot of villages, as the sea's changing, they're kind of dropping off into the ocean. We see it also on the East Coast, and they're going to have to move. There was one village that was moving a small number of people at the cost of 150 million. Now we have many, many more people who are in desperate situation, and so it's going to be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in order to help them relocate and build new housing, even if it's out, what we would think of as very remote locations. Um, it's going to be very difficult. So I don't think that there's a lot of coordination on that. I think, people are aware of the problem and just starting to see the consequences of this kind of thing. So we have seen a few examples in Alaska of cities, of small towns having to move. Um, but you have similar situations in Louisiana, North Carolina,
Yeah.
places like that where the waters are coming up. So there's just going to have to be some more attention paid to this. And unfortunately, that's not the exact opposite is happening in this country. I think the Europeans are also quite constrained in the resources they have. And so uh, I think we understand what the problem is, but haven't had it been able to focus on it yet.
There was a
Oh,
movie
go
on
ahead,
Net.
Don. Go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, trivial. Go ahead.
No, this was something a little bit different. So finish up what you're saying because I had another question.
Oh, there was a movie. It's on Netflix, and the name I can't remember. I'll try to find it before we close. It's about one of the Scandinavian countries declaring that it had to close down because of rising sea levels, and everyone had to move. I think mostly to France, and the trauma, and it's a movie, the melodrama of it's horrifying. And you look at an uncontrolled reality of having to shift large populations. It's horrible and
Right,
devastating. So, okay, that's
right.
all.
I haven't seen that movie, but if we're gonna have to moving to France doesn't sound too bad. Uh, but you're right. I mean, the trauma of having to move is quite extreme for a lot of people. I mean, you have this real sense of place. People like to be in the place where they grew up, where their friends are, where their families are, where they have their memories. Um, so that can be quite difficult. Um, on the other hand, we used to move around all the time. Certainly, the indigenous people living in Alaska would move according to the climate, often according to the weather, according to the season. according to where the resources were, and sometimes they were in one place, sometimes in another. So like in the past of human history, we're much more migratory than we are now. So I think to some extent, it's only been recently we had such permanent structures and that made it possible to live in one place. Um,
Bob,
year
more to
round.
that, more on that point. I've read on several occasions where the ice melt in the Arctic is roughly 4 times what it is in the rest of the globe, and I don't quite understand how that could be, but that's apparently the number. And that interestingly, in this morning's New York Times, oddly enough, there's an article on Svalbard, which you might see, or you probably will see. And if I recall, it mentions that the ice melt there in that area has been measured to be 7 times what it is. So I wonder, first of all, I can't quite imagine how there could be that dramatic a difference between the melt in the Arctic and the Antarctic. I mean, that's for the scientists to, I guess, get their thoughts together on that. But do you have any more thoughts on that? I mean, it's a dramatic number if it in fact is correct.
Yeah, I think that's what we call Arctic amplification. And each year, the number has gone from 2 times to 3 times to 4 times. I think what they're referring to is the temperature change. So that the temperature is changing 4 times as fast right now in the Arctic as it is on the rest of the planet. That's the usual article. That there's one article that came out a couple years ago that demonstrates that, and it's widely cited in every single article you read about the Arctic starts off with that one, that the change there it is now 4 times. And of course, climate change is not uniform around the north. So some places are actually getting a little bit colder. Some places are getting much, much hotter. So you have, depending on where you're located, the local conditions and the broader trends, you have a very discontinuous temperature change. And so so maybe in Svalbard, I didn't see that article in the Times yet, but maybe there's, it's a little bit warmer than it is in other neighboring regions. So that's kind of what we're seeing. It's like global warming in general, but bits and pieces of the globe are going at different speeds. Um, but the Arctic does seem to be changing a lot faster. So often it's considered, the canary in the coal mine. Like what we're seeing in the Arctic is a sign of what's to come for the rest of the planet. So that speeding up is not a good sign.
I had a
The movie in the chat box.
I have a question. Perhaps I dropped off the screen for a minute as my laptop slipped, but so perhaps you addressed this and I didn't hear it. But I remember reading that Russia is because of the melting of the permafrost, that there are Russian bases and I assume American bases as well, military bases that were built on the permafrost and are now having to be moved. Is
Yeah.
that or rehashed or whatever? Is Russia doing this? Is this going on?
I'm not aware of anything like that, anything that dramatic. But certainly there's lots of pictures of buildings in Russia where the permafrost is thawing underneath them and they're the structures are caving into the ground. And so that also happens on roads and runways and things like that. Um, and yeah, some of my colleagues here at George Washington University have been developing models to predict out as the climate changes, what is the impact going to be on the infrastructure in the Arctic? So military bases, but cities and other things. Like a lot of Russian cities are actually built in the north on permafrost. But the Russians were, and my Russian colleagues love to point this out, they're definitely world leaders in understanding how to do construction on permafrost. So typically, when in a lot of northern cities, you'll see houses on stilts. And so the thing is, you want to keep the ground frozen so it stays stable. And then you don't want to put a warm building because we all like our houses around 72 degrees or more. You don't want to put that right on top of the ice and the permafrost. And so they put them on stilts and create a layer of air underneath. And then typically, as things change, there's all kinds of jacks and other ways so that as each year you might push this side of your house up and let that side come down a little bit to restabilize it. And so this is the kind of construction that the Russians have really developed. And then, so when we were building like the Alaska Highway, which goes from Montana all the way up to Fairbanks, things like that, we were relying heavily on Russian technology, Russian techniques and innovations on how to do construction on the permafrost and really understand that. So since they live with the cold, it's part of the, Siberia, it's much more part of their culture than it is ours. We're also as the US, we're an Arctic country, but most of us don't identify closely with Alaska.
Well, the Arctic, Russia controls what, 50%, something like that of the Arctic, right? As the United
Yeah.
States is 15%, right? And
Right, we're very small.
even Canada is only like 25%. So do you think that there's the war in the Ukraine? I mean, in this trade-off, is Putin putting money into, is the concern there about the Arctic? I mean, I may have missed you saying something earlier about this.
Um, I think that Putin has to spend so much money on the war in Ukraine, developing the drone technology and the number of soldiers. I think something like 800 soldiers are dying there every day, that it's a huge amount of resources. And as a result, he really doesn't have money left over for investment in the far north or in Siberia, other parts of the country. So I think it doesn't seem like the Russian economy is going to collapse anytime soon, but this war is definitely putting a strain on the Russian budget. So, it really is a war of attrition at this point. Who's going to last longer? Um, and so what the kind of Arctic development that we might have seen in the past is not happening right now. Um, in part because of the war. I mean, in part, the Russian state is highly corrupt too, until they talk about developing these cities and military bases and things like that. But often the money gets diverted to other uses, personal uses, things like that. So Russia is a threat, but I don't think it's as much of a threat as it seems like with that map I was showing, looking at the number of bases and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Um,
Uh, Bob, you may have noticed where we've done a deal with Finland, ordering, I think, 11 or 12 icebreakers. And as you're aware, probably we only own about 3 of them, I think, and the Russians have many, many more because they have more use for icebreakers up in the north, and to begin with. But how did we get so far behind? I don't know if you've looked into icebreaker technology and so forth, but apparently we're woefully behind in our interest and focus on building icebreakers. I know there's a lot more stuff to be built, and maybe it's a secondary or tertiary issue, but we sure got way behind in that contest.
Right, that's true. And certainly the people in Alaska have been pushing for more and more icebreakers. I think usually the number I hear is that we have 1.5 icebreakers. Like the second one doesn't quite work, or it's always
Right.
it's
Right.
always getting fixed or something like that. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I guess it's kind of a question for the military. Do they see strategic interest in having as many more icebreakers as that? And where would we actually deploy them and use them? And so I don't know, when we look at the Northern Sea route, like the route above Russia, which in theory could connect Chinese shipping over to Europe and save a lot of time instead of having to go through the Suez Canal. Um, I think it's going to be there's going to be more shipping up there, but I don't think it's really is going to be as popular as people think it is, simply because it's still going to be cold and it's still going to be dangerous and stormy to go up there. There's not a lot of search and rescue, and at the moment, the Russians are trying to charge a huge fee for any ships that go across there. So I don't think it's going to replace the Suez Canal, and same in Canada. I think there's some real questions there. The Canadians are concerned about their sovereignty. I think the US would like to have free shipping through the northern part of Canada, as talking about international waters. And the Canadians are a little bit concerned, who are these ships coming through? One of the speakers at the conference was talking about ships that were going by and then stopping on land and doing something, and the Canadians didn't know what was going on. So I think in both cases, I think it's going to be possible. We'll see more cruise ships and things like that up in these areas, but I don't think it's going to be a huge place for trade. Although it will make it possible for people who live in that part of Canada and that part of Russia to come in and out and to do projects that are connected to northern Russia, northern Canada. But I don't really see them as major trade routes. And maybe over time, as the ice melts in the whole Arctic Ocean, you might start to see a lot of trade that way, but it'll probably only be seasonal. And even then, it'll be difficult. And so I think at the moment, the main constraint is the insurance companies. They don't want to insure shipping that's going through that area because they're not convinced that the risk is low enough for them to make it profitable.
I thought
Yeah.
I also read that the type of ice that's being generated is different now, what with climate change, that it's not the sort of normal ice formation that they're dealing with, that they're dealing with new formations, and that actually has cut back the number of days that it's actually really viable, easily viable to use the shipping lanes.
Right. Yeah, there's lots of colleagues who focus on sea ice. I'm not
Okay.
one of them, but my
Well,
sense
I'm
is
not either.
that
I just read a
there's a
paragraph in
lot
the
there's a
Times
lot
or
less
something.
ice. Yeah, the extent of the ice is much smaller than it used to be. And then often in the past we would have older ice that would accumulate over 3 or 4 years, so it would get much thicker. Now it might melt, it all melts in the summertime and then it grows back a little bit in the winter, but that ice is much thinner. So potentially you could have more access to the northern waters, but it's not quite clear.
Could I ask one more question? And then if there's anybody else in the panel or anything else in the questions, then we should let Bob go because he's been very generous with the time. But my understanding is that, like for the Sami people, there are, their culture crosses borders. So across Scandinavia and Russia, right? And there are international organizations. Do they have any impact aside from the case where they were trying to block um, wind production in Sweden?
Yes, the Sami, right, you're right. They're all across Northern Europe and they do go into Western Russia. Um, it's been very difficult for them to coordinate across borders. And so the Sami people are permanent, what do they call it? Permanent participants in the Arctic Council. So that whole group. But for example, when the Arctic Council decided to stop its main diplomatic activities because of the Russian invasion, the Sami people were not consulted in that decision. So, at the diplomatic level, there was a concern about the Russian war in Ukraine. The Sami people, of course, their perhaps primary interest was in keeping relations with their relatives in Russia. And so these two values kind of come into conflict a little bit. Whereas, the Sami do want to have those cross-border connections so they can advocate on wind power and other issues as a collective. But it is very difficult because of the national constraints. And Putin obviously is the Russian context is much more repressive than the European context. And so there is a group of indigenous representatives in Russia called Raipon, but Putin thought that they were too independent, so he replaced the old leadership and put, Kremlin supporting people, indigenous people, in charge of that now. So it's not really clear that the organizations that ostensibly represent the Sami people in Russia are truly advocating for their interests and not really politically controlled by the Russian government. So all these usual geopolitical situations make it very difficult to have that kind of continuity across with the Sami people. But the Inuits also have international groups. And so increasingly, we're starting to see more indigenous advocacy and visibility. Like I'm going to the COP conference, the climate change conference in Brazil, and at previous ones, there's been a lot of indigenous activity on issues of climate change because it really affects their lands. And so every now more and more at international conferences, within the U.S. in terms of Alaskans, they're advocating more and more. So we're starting to see more of that visibility.
Thank you. So,
Yes. maybe one last question,
Yes,
Carolyn.
please. Yeah, go.
If Bob will permit us. No, putting your geopolitical hat on, if you will, and crystal balling a little bit, what are your thoughts on the future of Greenland? Will Trump achieve his his heartfelt
Great
desire to make
question.
it part of the U.S. or just I know you might not want to render an opinion given what's going on out there in terms of retribution, but hopefully you'll be willing to.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share my thoughts. I don't think that Greenland is ever going to become part of the United States. I mean, we've certainly, in the past during World War II and early and other times, we built military bases there and had a large presence there. And I think, despite everything, the Greenlanders, they're thinking about their situation inside of Denmark. They feel like they've often been mistreated or treated as a colonial part of the kingdom of Denmark. And so, there's some idea that they want to become independent, but at the moment they rely heavily on subsidies from the Danish government. And so being independent for them would mean having to cut deals with China, with the US, in terms of to support their economic sovereignty. And so I think their economy, in essence, is focused on fishing now. And going forward, it could be also tourism. Like I think they could easily make themselves into something like Iceland if they wanted to. And we had this year we had the first direct flight from the U.S. to Nuuk, which has expanded its air force, its airport and landing strip. So now it can accept the bigger planes. So it's increasingly possible that tourism will be a big part of the future of Greenland. So I think the Greenlanders, from what I was hearing at the conference, are interested in more tourism, more fishing, and they have deep concerns about mining. There's been a lot of mining that's taken place in Greenland and potentially a lot more as people start looking for rare earth metals and trying to reduce dependence on China. But it's not clear. In the past, that kind of mining hasn't had a lot of benefits for the local people in Greenland, and they see the negative consequences. So that's a big question mark going forward. I think when Trump thinks about Greenland, he sees it as a great big resource that we could use to reduce dependence on China and give ourselves more power in the world system. But I'm not sure that's the way the Greenlanders really think about it. And so they're going to hopefully have a big voice in what happens there too. And so I think they're going to try and minimize that sort of outside control. But it's just like everywhere else. There's a variety of opinions among the Greenlanders, and there's no consensus. Some people would support closer ties to the U.S. Some people would be appalled by that. Some people would support mining. Some people wouldn't. So it's hard to know where it's all going to come out. But those are the issues that they're grappling with.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Bob. Joan, are you there?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. I want to thank Bob on behalf of the committee. He's been very generous with his time.
yeah.
And so this has been fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and opened up all sorts of windows about things that I hadn't thought about. And we tend in this committee to look at sort of geopolitical, military activities and so forth. And yet what you brought in was a whole wealth of other aspects, which I think are equally as important and certainly instrumental. So I want to say that our next program is going to be on November 3rd, Monday, and Stephanie Lopez, who has a doctorate in political science and international relations, and she's an expert on international migration, refugees, forced displacement, government migration, and so forth, is going to be talking. And the title of her talk is Effects of the United States Migration Policy Shifts on Displacement in Latin America. So we're going from the far north to Latin America. And that will be on November 3rd, on Monday at 10 o'clock. And again, hosted by the library. So is there anybody on the committee that would like to say anything before Joan cuts us out?
I do. Well,
Thank you, Bob.
Yes,
you,
thank
Bob.
you, Bob.
and we
Yeah.
have some thank yous that you'll see in the chat function.